I'm David Putnam, Director of Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention, on behalf of myself and all of the folks at ORTII and the Oregon Department of Education and the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I just want to welcome everybody today. Thank you for joining us. I don't know about other folks, but we have had a stretch of really beautiful, glorious weather, spring-like weather here up in the Portland metro area. And I think it's been great, something we all needed in terms of a little lift. And speaking of glorious, we're going to be talking about data today, which is a glorious thing and really kind of a backbone through an MTSS system that drives the excellent and effective instructional practices that we want to deliver, as well as informs equity in a very significant way. So this is a really important session in that regard. Just a few things in terms of the logistics as you sign on. If you could add your district name next to your name in Zoom, just click on your picture and you'll get an option to rename, and then we know where folks are from, and that'll help orient everybody. If you have specific questions during the webinar, please enter them in the chat. We'll do our best to respond as we go along. Excuse me. Closed captioning is available. It's a digital transcription, so we can't guarantee that it's going to be perfect, but it actually works pretty well. So click that on if you want that. And just so everybody knows, we will share this PowerPoint and a recording of the session at the end, as well as resource and some other materials. So we haven't shared that yet, but we will in the day or two that follows the session today. And then we ask that you please complete the evaluation at the end of the session. We'll put we'll drop a link into the chat, and we'll also send it out with the materials afterwards. But if you could get a chance to just complete that at the end of the day today, that would be great. Okay, so today's agenda, just having a little introduction here. We'll have an activity to activate your learning, get you thinking. And then we're going to go through Tier 1 and assessment practices, database decision making, and then a core review process, the teaming process that we refer to as core review. We'll move then to Tier 2, same thing, look at assessment and database decision making and what we refer to as intervention assignment or placement at Tier 2. We won't get into Tier 3 this time, but we will when we at our next session, okay? And intervention review also is part of that Tier 2 process. And then we'll just wrap up with some next steps and evaluation. So that's the agenda for today. Just some other upcoming learning opportunities. We do have our annual conference. You can visit our website. And if you don't receive something through the email, but March 31st, ensuring inclusive practices for students with disabilities. And then on April 28th, effective instruction based in the science of reading. And then we'll wrap up with an end note on May 6th. It's a standalone 90-minute session with Anita Archer, and she is going to weave it all together and present on equity, making it happen through inclusive practices, multi-tiered systems of support, and science-based reading instruction. All right, so just some agreements as we start out here. You know, this session, as with all of these sessions in this series, is going to be focus a great deal on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And as such, we just ask that everybody is respectful of everyone else's diverse experiences and that you allow space for individual questions, thoughts, and learning to occur. All right, so let's now get to a quick little activity to activate your learning. What I'd like you to do is take about a minute to do a quick read of this passage or section that we've borrowed from the Wisconsin MTSS folks that does a nice job of just giving a good, concise overview of assessment and database decision making in MTSS. So take a quick read, about a minute of that, and then we'll take another just 30 seconds to enter a quick thought about how might the collection and use of assessment data promote equitable access to instruction. Okay, so just a first thought, type that in the chat after you do a quick read of this section, and I'll give folks just a quick 90 seconds to do that starting right now. I'm not seeing comments in the chat. There we go. We've got some things popping in. One comment that it was difficult to read because it was small. I apologize for that.
We sorted that out, David.
Okay. All right. It looked big on my
We're
screen.
good to go.
Excellent. So I'm not going to run through these right now because we do want to press forward. But hopefully that gave you some time to just think about the kind of things that we are going to be talking about today that's captured here, and to start to process that and be thinking in terms with all of this as it relates to equitable practices. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Arden, who also now extend the introduction and get into a little bit of content introduction.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. For those of you who haven't seen me as part of these webinars, my name is Sarah Arden. I work with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We have a partnership with Oregon RTI and have been working with them for the past 4 years or so. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide. I'm going to continue to extend just a couple of slides as we do the intro here. Some interesting things that I'm really seeing in the chat are talking about making sure that data is reviewed, having teaming approaches, matching supports, disaggregating information, identifying supports. I see a lot about teams and a lot about sort of co-ownership of data and equity. So I'm really encouraged to see sort of what you're talking about, because I think it really touches on what we're going to address for the rest of this webinar. So a couple of slides that I wanted to present, and this is just sort of to spark your thinking before I pass it along to my great colleagues at Oregon RTI, is to think about how we position data and how we position assessment within MTSS as an organizing context, and then also think about equity and outcomes and systems kind of all in this mix. So we've got this sort of pot with all of these things kind of combined. And what do we think about here? So we've given you some sort of statements, this graphic on the left-hand side of the slide, this Venn diagram about how these things are overlapped within the organizing context of MTSS, and some statements. These are really just statements for you to ponder and to think about. If you've come to some of these webinars before, we've presented you with some extension activities. And so I want to encourage you to think about, is this the way that your school, your district, your grade level, you as a teacher in your classroom are thinking about equity and data and assessment? So we put equity at the center of everything we do. We're going to talk a lot more about what that means and what truly is equity, but you can see that that's represented in this slide. And then when we think about outcomes, do we define outcomes that reflect equitable learning opportunities for all students? So sometimes we get in trouble when we define outcomes quite narrowly and students then don't hit that narrow outcome. Sometimes we say, well, they didn't grow or they didn't achieve what we wanted to because they didn't hit this teeny tiny target. So are we defining outcomes that reflect equity? We can go to the next slide here. Are we using multiple rich data sources to inform the strengths and needs of our practices and our systems? And you'll see here that we're talking about the needs of our systems and really thinking about who were our systems designed to support and who are not benefiting, who is not benefiting from our systems, that sort of thing, rather than saying, why isn't this student doing X? Really sort of thinking about this from a system level. And then the next sort of piece of the Venn diagram you'll see is, are we implementing with both consistency and effectiveness as a mechanism to support students? So we have this system, but are we engaging in the components of our system both consistently and with fidelity, so that if our system is really designed with equity in mind, are we engaging with it faithfully within sort of our context? And then the last slide with this sort of, graphic really talks about practices and how practices are sort of embedded and engaged with all of these pieces, right? Do we embed evidence-based strategies across all educational environments? A lot of times we think evidence-based practices and we automatically think academics, but are we thinking about it for social emotional? Are we thinking about it for behavior and mental health? Are we thinking about it for the way that we track attendance data? Are we thinking about evidence-based practices and student perception data and family perception data? Are we thinking about it for the way that we look at providing meals to students? There's evidence-based practices around all sorts of things rather than just this maybe particular academic program. So These are just statements to get you to think about kind of how these pieces fit together. My colleagues are going to talk much more about this at core and tier two. Just some things to sort of spark your interest. I would encourage you as teams, if this is something you're interested in, sort of expanding more or thinking through a little bit more, that you sit with these statements as a group and really say, are we doing these? And then go beyond that and say, and how do we know, right? What is our evidence? How do we know that we're doing these and how can we get better? So I think my last slide really, oh no, sorry, I have two more slides. This next slide really talks about database decision making across multiple levels. So I see that there are people here from all across districts. I see people from Washington, Oregon, sort of all over the place. I can't tell based on your roles here, or if you're a classroom teacher, a district administrator, if you work at an ESD. But what we want to say is that we recognize that database decision makings happen across multiple levels. They happen at the system level, they happen at districts, they happen at ESDs, they happen at states. They also happen at practice, the practice level, or what for this webinar we're going to call the grade level. Excuse me. For our purposes today, we're really going to talk about these database decisions that happen at the grade level. So things that teachers and educators can really engage in. That is not to take away from the kinds of systems level or district or broader systems pieces that often need to happen or need to be in place. But what we want to do is really focus on the teacher sort of practices that can happen in order to sort of focus on outcomes. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's some system level examples of data-based decisions that can happen. Resource allocation, ensuring common measurement tools are available, providing training on data fluency, et cetera. Really critical pieces that happen, but also really critical practices that need to happen at the grade level or at the classroom level or the teacher level that we're going to talk about. Things like developing climates of co-ownership. All educators are responsible for all students. Using a variety of assessments to collect qualitative and quantitative data to capture progress. Creating flexible instructional groups, delivering high quality core instruction. That's where we're going to sort of focus today, but we did want to sort of recognize that these kinds of decisions happen across the board. And then my last slide just provides some guiding questions that we're going to use as we move forward, but also guiding questions that we would encourage you to think through as you're thinking about data sources as a mechanism towards equity and how you kind of guide your work as a district. So what data sources should you consider collecting to determine if students are making academic progress? Is that just one source of data from one assessment? Are there multiple sources? Are you looking at behavioral data or social emotional data as a mechanism to measure academic progress? Just some things to think about. How do database decision-making and teaming structures promote equitable decision-making? Are you always talking about the same kids and the same time with the same teams? Are there ways that we're sort of inadvertently creating equities because of our assessment systems? And really, how do we change our systems to promote equity and inclusion? So again, kind of going back to that, who are our systems designed to support? Who are they supporting? And who is not benefiting from the systems that we have? So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass it along to my colleagues to really start talking about data systems and core and equity. But hopefully that got you sort of sparked some thinking about some questions you'd like to ask.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. So now we're going to get into just framing, more specifically the content for today. So you can move to the next slide, Lisa. And this is a graphic organizer in a sense that talks about assessment and teaming practices across the tiers. And you need to be thinking about your assessment system and having a continuum that is coherent and articulated. And across each tier, you're going to have your assessment components. You're going to have your collaborative database decision-making and problem solving. And all of that is intended to be functionally driven and focused on driving instruction with equitable outcomes as always part of the target. So, and this next slide here, don't get lost right now in all the content because there's a lot. This will be something we share as a resource, but this is a document that we put together that just helps really define those three tiers and tiers of support. And notice that we talk about tiers of support, and it's really important that you check your language and you think about these tiers as being the supports and the things that we do as professionals to provide and support students who aren't students that are a tier 1 student, aren't students that are a tier 2 student. They are students, and the tiers they're in has nothing to do with their identity or who they are. Only the kind of supports that they are receiving at any one given time, and it's entirely fluid. But anyway, keep this in mind as a reference document, again, that we'll share later, and we'll come back to this in each section too. So with that, we can move forward. And, and then just another general organizer again, I want to just share a little piece that's part of, that's included in our core review protocol that we'll talk more about later. And that's this thought, which is really key, that to achieve equity and ensure continuity across instructional tiers, we must continuously evaluate the impact of our practices and strategies on all student groups, especially those groups that have been historically underserved or marginalized. And essentially what we're talking about is keeping that lens and then always disaggregating data at every turn. And if there's one takeaway from today, for me, that's really one of the keys, is you've got to be disaggregating data and looking honestly and deliberately and directly at all different student groups and looking at who you are supporting and who you're not supporting and where you need to make change. You can move to the next slide now. And essentially, that's what I was just saying, what's captured here. Disaggregate your data, look at who your system is serving at the whole group and individual level, who it is not serving. And you also need to engage a continuum of participants in your system. So that range from educators to caretakers, community members. And that doesn't mean that you'll have all of these included in every teaming process. And in fact, some of what we'll be talking about are teaming practices that are specific to data, drive decisions, at the grade level, as Sarah said. But with other practices, you want to include community members, et cetera, so that you really have a broad look and broad input to ensure that you're addressing the needs of your entire community. And so we'll be talking today about these kind of essential features in a general way, and we'll also be sharing some specific examples that are examples from our project. But just keep in mind that you can get at, and a district can get at, operationalizing these key essential features in a variety of ways, and it's going to look different district to district. Okay, and with that, now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Kay, who is going to dig into the first real content chunk for the day. So Nicole, take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, David and Sarah, for grounding the work that we'll be covering today. So next, we will look at how we can determine student progress with Tier 1 supports using what we call at Oregon RTII a core review process. So many of you may be familiar or currently have a core review process in place. There are many different names that different places use. Some others we have heard are universal screening meetings. You may call it a 100% meeting or a benchmark meeting. In essence, though, a core review process comprises examining universal screening and other relevant data as a team in order to inform a grade level plan that supports all students' access, engagement, and their reading skill development. So as David highlighted, here's an example zoomed into our Tier 1 support that outlines the features of a core review process, including the fact that in this process, the purpose is to examine data to support all students, since all students receive Tier 1 instruction. We will highlight some of the logistical features of holding these meetings towards the end of the presentation. So before we go further into the core review process, let's take a moment here to pause and reflect on your current process for reviewing the impact of Tier 1 instruction. So these are the general steps one would take in the process to ensure that we are making efficient and accurate and equitable instructional decisions to support students. So we're going to do this little activity through a Zoom poll here. And so when the dialog box pops up, please just review all of the items and then select each and every item that your district or that your place of work currently has in place. So my lovely assistant, Jamie, will pull that up. So go ahead and take a moment to reflect and then add your answers. All right, I see the data rolling in, and we love data here. All right, thanks for entering. Okay, we have a majority now that have placed their votes in. All right, we still have a few folks that are still responding, but I see a pattern emerging here. It's very interesting. We didn't make this happen this way, but that actually works out pretty interestingly. Here I'm seeing that the majority of you, or what's most likely to be in place, is that first step, and then it kind of tapers off, and the least likely component that people have currently is that number 4. Very interesting. So thank you all. Let's see, I'm just gonna click to share the results. So thanks everyone who participated, and I hope that in this next section that you all find something valuable that you can bring back to enhance your current process. Okay, can we, next slide? Perfect, thank you. So let's go through those steps in turn. So the first step is to review our universal screening data at the grade level to determine how our Tier 1 supports are impacting our students. So in the example bar graph, the first bar on the left-hand side displays the goal that this example district would like to see across grade levels. So in this case, the goal they set is to have at least 80% or more of their students performing at or above the benchmark for reading proficiency. The bar to the right displays this grade level's actual proportions of students performing at benchmark, which is in green, below benchmark, which is listed in yellow, or well below benchmark, which is in red. So in this example, if we were district looking at our data, this shows that 75% of all students at that grade level are performing at benchmark, which is pretty close to their goal. So if I was in that district, I'd feel pretty good about that. Okay, and as another part of this initial step, you'll also want to examine and consider other forms of data, such as access and attendance and engagement data. So how you choose to measure these components and the resources that you have to do so will really vary across context. But here we're just displaying a section of our Oregon RTII's core review process agenda. And for our model, in each section, there are designated reflection questions. And these we call pause points, because we want to make sure that we're being very intentional about what we're reflecting on. And since this is a live digital form, there are also embedded links that lead to further descriptions of these measures. So of course, you could choose to integrate other data of your choice as well. And these are just some examples to kind of get you thinking and just get you started. Okay, so the next step is to use multiple sources of data to identify areas of literacy skills that need to be supported across the grade level. So the best starting place is your universal screener. So you want to be sure to look at the subtest or subskill data to inform how students are performing within each area of the big five of reading. So in case you haven't heard, they are phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And please note that not all skills are tested at all grade levels. Especially notable is PA dropping off after the early grade levels, but you may wish to incorporate additional indicators for these skills. So you could look at instructional observations or curriculum based assessments, in-program assessments. This would also be a good time in the process to examine things like your access and engagement data to inform other ways in which your team could support your students' literacy skill development. Again, this is just that was just a snapshot from our protocol. Yours could look different. So the third step is then determining your student-specific instructional needs. And then you want to use that analysis to develop a robust plan for differentiated supports. So at this point in the process, it can be helpful to have district documents for you to reference. So many districts, especially those that work with us, develop kind of a standardized approach to having either something called a standard reading protocol, or they might have standards of practice, which really just outlines what curriculum you're using, the time dedicated to that curriculum, what resources you have, and also may include evidence-based instructional strategies. And this is a really nice approach because then even though you're looking at this data at the grade level, you know what plan you develop echoes or parallels other plans across the district. And your plan could also focus on, you might consider organizing your small group instruction. And this is small group instruction that's provided during that core reading block. So that tier 1 support time. And ensuring that it is skill-based and differentiated to meet the needs of each student. Another possibility during this portion is to leverage your universal design for learning elements and incorporate and embed those into your plan. So the fourth and critically important step, and as demonstrated in the poll, this one was the least likely to be currently happening. So pull up a chair for this one. The fourth and critically important step is to explore our data to determine if we're disproportionately impacting our students in tier 1 supports. So we can do this in numerous ways, but we will need to dig deeper into our data here and explore multiple aspects, such as your demographic data. And that could, vary widely. Demographic data could include race and ethnicity categories, special education identification, SES, language, gender, and more. There's many that we can think through. And this also involves digging deeper into our screening data and our access and engagement data. So this is the part where we will look deeper into our universal screener, and we'll look at the data in both its aggregate form, but it's also, as David mentioned earlier, is really important to disaggregate this data by various groups. So we can use this information to explore if and where disproportionality exists within our system. So let's use an example to kind of highlight this idea. Okay. So as you will recall, the data that we shared earlier, just moments ago, showed that the school's universal screening data appears strong overall and comes close to aligning well with their intended goal of at least 80% of students meeting benchmark and reading proficiency. Can you move forward one animation? Perfect. So that's just, this bar shows the aggregate form of our universal screener. And again, looks pretty good. If we only looked at the screening data in the aggregate form though, we might be led to believe or to think that we are currently meeting the needs of all students, or that all students are benefiting more or less equally from Tier 1 supports. However, as you can see in um, the four other bar aspects, um, in this example, when we disaggregated the screening data by standardized race and ethnicity categories, a powerfully different story emerges. Although the average percentage of students at benchmark was strong for students identifying as white, so 77%, we can see that performance in other racial categories are varied. And in particular, we can compare um, the performance categories of white students, so again, 77% at benchmark, to students who identify as Hispanic Latino, who 40% performed at the benchmark level. This is of serious concern, and if you have data like this, it's imperative to figure out why our Tier 1 supports are not having as much of a positive impact on our Hispanic and Latino students. And then we need to figure out how to provide additional supports to better support their learning. And just again, please note that this is just one small example, but you could definitely explore many other pieces of data in a similar manner to uncover potential disproportionalities in other areas. So what if, or what can we do if we uncover that we are, it could be inadvertently, but if we are disproportionately impacting students in our Tier 1 supports, what can we do? So first, we'll need to consider adjusting our core instruction and related supports. So perhaps there is a need for some students to have, maybe access to a smaller group size during core. So that small group differentiated instruction, maybe we can make those groups smaller. Perhaps we could add more staff members to assist with providing additional scaffolding for discourse in certain parts of the day. So at this point in the process, this is where teaming and collaboration is just so important. There are many reasons why we are not seeing the impacts that we want for our students. And as such, the potential solutions can be very creative. So you can go even deeper with data and information here. Perhaps reviewing student and family perception data. So I think David mentioned that earlier. So looking at qualitative data, looking at quantitative data, looking at different perspectives and voices, looking at core walkthrough observations, or examining our discipline practices or our discipline policies. So the idea here is to try to get a holistic view of what is happening so that our Tier 1 support system can be set up to truly support all students. So here's just a quick breakout of past practices or things we can think of as past practices and present practices. So always moving forward, always improving. We can move towards using multiple sources of data. I hope these my examples here and the ones you're going to see in just a moment will convince you that using multiple sources of data can be very powerful. The importance of disaggregating that data to see effects on our various groups, and the fact that we need a clear teaming process and structure to create the best plan of support. So as promised, here's a brief overview of the logistics of conducting a core review process. I think I saw someone in the chat was wondering about how often these different meeting processes occur. And so the core review happens following universal screening, which is 3 times a year. Okay. So I just want to leave you with some potential action steps and extension activities to extend your learning and exploration in this area. So here's some of our suggestions for activities or processes that teachers and leaders could do. And we really want you to take these ideas and uncover your own scenarios or examples within your context. So we can show examples, but we don't know what's happening within your system. So these are some of the suggestions we have for you. One, first, if you aren't already disaggregating data, a barrier you could remove or would need to remove is to ensure that your data system is set up such that you have that demographic data and such that you can disaggregate that data easily. Another thing you can do is reflect with your team, like go back with your team and have a discussion on reflecting on your current practices with core review process, and see if maybe there was something here today that you went, oh, you know what, I think we can add that in. And the third idea is either conducting what we could call an empathy interview of students, or do a observation series. So essentially, in-person instruction is a little bit easier, where we've had districts be very successful with following a student throughout their entire instructional day, and they actually selected several students, and we would recommend getting a diverse range of grades and disability status and gender, and as many variations as you can. But you follow that student throughout their instructional day or their instructional experience and see what insights do you gain. There's been some really interesting things uncovered. So for example, do you notice that certain students are, effectively pushed out and are missing critical content in the general education classroom? Or is there inconsistent or confusing instructional language or too many transitions? So seeing that happening firsthand can be a really powerful process that we encourage you to do. All right, and I will leave you, it says resources. There are multiple resources, but just through one link that leads you to our agenda protocol, which I showed here, as well as some impact worksheets. And with that, I will give it to Lisa Bates to lead our next section.
Yes, so the next section is going to be focused on those tier 2 supports. And the first part of that is really that we need to make sure that we're matching interventions to students' needs. This way we give them the right intervention. So we call that intervention placement. By placement, we're not talking about sending them to a place for them to get those tier 2 supports. Those tier 2 supports can happen anywhere that makes sense for your context for that. So what is intervention placement? Simply, it's just a team using their universal screening data and then other relevant data to identify and assign students to their tier 2 supports. And if you recall, David showed this slide in the beginning. And what we really mean by these tier 2 supports is primarily using a targeted supplemental intervention program. We want to be able to use that program with fidelity first, so this way we know if we need to make adjustments. So it's really important that we kind of use that structured program at this level so we kind of know what our students need, and we know that they're getting those evidence-based instructional practices with lots of I do, we do, you do. So this way we can see if they're benefiting from that instruction. So these are kind of the steps that we kind of go through. I separated number one out from the rest because number one is really critical for us to look at to see if really we are, with the data that Nicole showed, are there bigger issues that are going on? Are there certain groups of students who are not benefiting from the core instruction? We won't be able to serve all those students in our tier 2 supports. So we're going to need to make adjustments to our core instruction first. So that piece is critical. So just want to explain that first, but we're going to do another poll. So as Nicole showed, you can read through these steps and then please in the poll identify which ones you feel that your school is currently doing. So Jamie, if you could pull up the poll. We have about half the people who have responded now. It seems like we're seeing somewhat of a trend, especially with the last step. Okay, looks like our polling has kind of slowed down. So we will just kind of see that it looks like the most people are doing is really actually using their screening data to identify the students in need of those tier 2 supports. And then less so of being able to use their screening data to kind of look at how their tier 1 supports might impact how you place kids into tier 2 supports. And then also if we're looking at, if we're disproportionately placing students into tier 2 supports. Sorry, I need to move things around. I'm the one screen sharing, so I have to do a couple extra steps here. So as I mentioned, we want to be looking at, these are the data Nicole showed for the groups that we have in this school district. And what we see is that, again, the Hispanic, Latino, and the multiracial students, there's a lot of them who are needing those more intensive supports. So again, we don't want to be putting all those students into interventions. We really want to be looking at what is going on with our system that is causing those disparities in how they're performing. And we need to think critically. We're not saying we don't want you to place those students into interventions, but we just need to have really hard conversations about what's going on in our system to make those decisions. So number 2 is that we're going to use those screening data to identify those students in need of tier 2 supports. This should be based on a decision rule. And typically we advise our districts to say that we're going to do the lowest 20% at that grade level. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. But we also want to validate that with additional sources. We can use core program assessments and also formative assessments to make sure that that screening data is valid and that we're making appropriate decisions for those students. So here is a grade level. It's first grade. It's a small grade. It has 21 students in it. If we look, we can see that there are 9 students, or 43% of this grade level, who are designated as well below benchmark. That would be a lot of students to be serving in interventions. There are other ways we can support these students. Primarily, we can be supporting some of them through that core instruction and specifically through small group targeted instruction during the core. But if we look at who the lowest 20% are, that's 4 students here. That would be much more manageable in our system to provide supports to those students So this way we don't water down our interventions. If we put too many kids in interventions, we're gonna run the risk of having too many kids in a group that they're not gonna get the feedback that they need and just that connection with adult that they need to make progress. Then we need to look at, are we determining the students' instructional needs? And then we need to assign them to tier 2 supports. So the data we can use for this is we really want to be looking to see how are they doing in those foundational skills. Nicole mentioned the 5 big ideas in reading. And then the foundational skills are the phonemic awareness, the phonics, and fluency. Those typically are the ones that we focus on for intervention supports or tier 2 supports. So for those, we can look at our universal screening subtests. They typically have assessments that link to those foundational skills, so we can see how they're doing on those. We can also use diagnostic assessments to assess those skills, and some core program assessments also assess those skills. There is a link there for intervention placement documents that TTSD, Tigard-Walton School District, uses that you can see just as resources for you. Now I just want to kind of show you an example of how we take a standardized approach and then use it to place kids into interventions at the tier 2 level. So this is an example of a standard reading protocol. And you can see there's a list of different intervention programs. So we're going to use those then to place the students into those appropriate interventions. So we look here, the students in the table on the right got placed in some of those interventions. And I wanted to show you this example of the tier 2 support groups, because you might be saying, why are there so few kids in those tier 2 support groups? And this is going to be kind of an added difficulty now from moving from CDL to hybrid instruction, because we might be, since kids are cohorted, this is, for example, the Tuesday, Thursday group, but we also have a Wednesday, Friday group, and then we also might have a CDL group. Kids are continuing to stay in that. So the groups might be smaller, and it might be a little more difficult to match kids like students together, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to do this. It's still really critical that we do the best that we can to match the students to the interventions they need and to move along in the process. Then we need to start looking at if we have disproportionate representation of students needing tier 2 supports. In this picture example I have here, we don't want to leave anyone behind. We want to make sure we're supporting all our students the best that we can. So we need to be asking, are we disproportionately placing kids in tier 2 supports? And how do we know? So this will depend on the size of the data, size of the groups that you have. So we generally would recommend if you have 20 or more students in a race or ethnicity group, or your ELL students, then you can use percentages to look at these data. If you have less than that, we prefer you to do a count, and I'll show you examples of that. But you would look at your school demographics. So you can look at race, ethnicity, and ELL would probably the primary ones you look at for seeing disproportionality in tier 2 supports. And then you'd be looking at how many students you actually placed into those tier 2 supports. And then we'll look at the students, a percent of students in each group who need those tier 2 supports. So here is an example of the school's demographics. You can see it has a wide student body with different student groups included in the school. But we can see that the 4 groups on the left have more than 20 students in their group. Hispanic Latinos have 240, the multiracial has 37 students, and so forth. So those are the ones we're going to look at disaggregating by percentages. So here are those students that we're going to look at, and we're going to see what proportion of them are needing interventions. So we can see that there are 47% of white students in this school. And then the 15% is showing that's how many of them we placed into our tier 2 supports. Then if we look at our Hispanic Latino students, there are 38% of them that make up the school population, but we placed 47% of them in tier 2 supports. Hope you're saying this is a problem. This is not what we want to be happening. We're definitely disproportionately placing our Hispanic and Latino students in those tier 2 supports. So we need to be asking ourselves, why is that happening? And we'll kind of show you some suggestions for that later. And then you can see the Native Hawaiian and multiracial art. We might even possibly be under-identifying those, but we're definitely not over-representing those. So then for the population groups that are less than 20, we just want to do count it by ourselves with the numbers that they have. So I'm just going to show one example of this. This is, I'm picking the Black African American group, and we have 18 of those students currently in the 2021 school year. And we place 7 of them into interventions. And we want to look at these data historically, just to get that trend. So 1920 school year, there are 15 of them in the school, and we place 5 of them into interventions. In 1819, there are 17, and then we place 6. In 1718 school year, there were 17 of the students in the school, and placed 7 of them into interventions. So again, we're seeing a pattern here of possibly over-representing our Black African American students into interventions. And again, we need to start asking ourselves why this is occurring. We're not saying that these students necessarily don't need interventions, but we need to think critically about who of these students truly need interventions, and maybe what can we change in our system so that these students are benefiting more appropriately from our core instruction. So the first thing we want to consider if we are disproportionately placing students into tier 2 supports is to go back to your core. Nicole said this, I'm going to say this, and Brad in the next session will talk about this as well. It's just critical that we go back to core and look at what we're doing to support students there. Small group target instruction is a perfect way to address some of these needs that the students have that is differentiated for their needs. And then we need to think about ways we can help that to happen. Doing small group target instruction is not always an easy task to do, but so this way we need to use our resources within the school to be able to support that. The other things then we need to think about, why is this happening? Why are we getting this disproportionality? So one thing we might want to do is to review the core curriculum, determine the cultural relevance and content and instructional practices. Is it the curriculum we're using, are kids engaged in it? Do they find meaning in it? Are they feeling connected to it? We might need to make adjustments if we're feeling that's not the case. Then we can also be reviewing our attendance exclusionary discipline practices and access engagement data, as Nicole mentioned, or maybe like our exclusionary discipline practices causing those students to be removed from the classroom, and therefore they're not getting core instruction. That would have a huge impact then on their assessment results. And same thing with the access and engagement. Maybe they're not engaged. How can we address that? Can we use those student interviews to find out if they're engaged or not? And can we support teachers in establishing better relationships with their students? And then we can look at our own internal implicit bias. We might inadvertently be thinking, well, that student just needs this intervention. I think, I feel, I believe, rather than using the data to drive those decisions. So here then are the logistics. The intervention placement meetings follow universal screening meetings. So they occur usually then the 2 times a year, because the last one you are then wrapping up the school year, but you can use that last data point or benchmarking to predict then for next year. That's often helpful. And you can see then the rest of the logistics. And then we just wanted to point out that this might be a change in practices from how we've done things in the past. Really in the past, we kind of just, maybe each teacher just was able to send 4 students to get for additional support. The way we're suggesting is really more that team approach. We're gonna provide those tier 2 supports to the students who are most in need. And we're gonna use decision rules to be able to make that decision. We wanna use multiple data sources to do that. And then really examine that disproportionality as well. And it's important to use a teaming structure around all this too, because sometimes we find that maybe your literacy specialist just engages in this intervention or tier 2 support placement by themselves. And then the teaching staff don't really know what's the intervention the student's getting or why they're getting that intervention. And that creates difficulties for them in terms of what they should do for small group instruction. We always want to try to connect what's happening in small group instruction with those tier 2 supports to make it more beneficial for the students. So now I'm going to pass it on to Brad, and he's going to talk more about how you determine if students are making progress with tier 2 supports.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm very grateful to be here with all of you as we continue to work on these critical systems of support for our students. Right now, we're going to discuss a process to determine if we are having impact with our tier 2 supports on all students, on student groups, and as individuals. We refer to this as an intervention review process. It's also known as a 20% meeting, and some others call it a group intervention review. Lisa, next slide, please. Thank you. So what is an intervention review process? Oregon Response to Instruction Intervention. This is our teaming process that we use. It's called an intervention review meeting. It's a teaming structure used to determine if students who are receiving tier 2 supports are making adequate progress towards those goals, and we make a plan accordingly depending on how that data looks to us. So next slide. So here's the main features of an intervention review process that you want to consider when you're building something like this. So number one feature is, do we have progress monitoring data? Are we collecting data, and do we have it? Do we have access to it, and who sees it? Number two, do we have a team that reviews it, uses that data to make some decisions? Number three, do we have a process and a team that is able to make decisions and make intensifications and adjustments based on predetermined decision rules and other options for making changes and adjustments to those interventions? And finally, as a team, do we have a process and a structure in order to examine disproportionate impact on student groups served in interventions? So I'm going to ask Jamie to pull up a poll, please. Yes, thanks, Lisa. And please select all that apply as far as what you have in place in your schools for reviewing the impact of tier 2 supports. So please take a few moments and select all that apply to you. Thank you. Thank you. We still have a few more people submitting their responses. A few more seconds. And we'll end the poll in 5, 4. Thank you so much. Very well. So many of us responded that yes, we're collecting progress monitoring data at 88%, but where we fall off is around the teaming structures and the process of looking at those and reviewing that data as a team and being able to make those decisions. Thank you. Okay, Lisa, you can advance, please. Okay, so the first step, the first feature that we have to have when we try to determine the impact of our tier 2 supports through this process is we have to have progress monitoring data. So as a school, do we have a systematic way in order to gather this data? And then once we have that data, who manages it, who sees it, and what are we going to do about it? Here we see a graph for a group based on their progress monitoring measures that we have taken over time. And as a team, we will look and review these through this process. But the very first thing that you have to have is you have to have progress monitoring data. And if we're not doing that, we're not going to be able to do and measure this impact of our tier 2 supports. Lisa? So the next feature that we have to have is we have to have a team. We have to have a team in order to do this. It's not good enough just to collect that data. We have to have a team to be able to support us, to review what we're doing, and also to suggest and make adjustments to these plans so we can support our students, all students in growing. Okay, it's critical at this team that we have not only grade level teams, it's our teachers. It's critical to have principals, other administrators, and also specialists that are going to support us developing plans and implementing these plans of supports. Lisa, next slide. The next thing that we do during this is, as a team, we're going to determine Are we having impact on our student groups? But we do that through looking at first the group as a whole. And if the group as a whole, all the students are growing with the design of that program, that is great. We're going to celebrate that. And we're either going to continue or exit kids depending on how much growth that they've had. And that's based on our decision rules. After that, though, we're going to have to determine if we're having inequitable impacts to portions of that group or to individuals in that group. So we take this approach. Are all students making progress? Awesome. If not, let's look at the group. Is the group overall making progress? If not, we have to problem solve and figure out why that's happening. Furthermore, if we notice that in that group, there's individuals, 1 or 2 individuals that are not making adequate progress, we have to problem solve for those individuals and determine what is causing that impact and those outcomes. Next slide. So the considerations that we have to make when we see a discrepancy and see kids not growing in the way that we want, we don't see the impacts that we want either at the group level or for the individual, we want to consider these factors because these factors are going to lead to those outcomes. We look through the 4 lenses. We look through the lens of instruction, we look through the lens of curriculum, we look through the lens of the environment, and we look through the lens of the learner. Okay, and we have to analyze the problem through all these different questions, determine what it is that we're doing that is not leading to the impacts and the outcomes that we want to see in our students. Earlier on, we talked about these tiers do not represent students. Once again, here, these do not represent students, it represents our actions and the actions that we can change to improve outcomes. And so we use these lenses of instruction, curriculum, environment, and learning to analyze what is happening. Why aren't we having the impact that we want? Next slide, please. Oh, there you go. You can pull up all of those pieces. There you go. I didn't know that was animated. So here's, oh, you can go back, please. Thank you so much. Here's a critical point at which we need to pause. And we need to understand and use multiple data points to ensure that we're centering equity and driving equity. So the question here is, why are some students responding to tier 2 supports while others are not? And how do we know? So some of the critical data points that you might want to collect and look at as a team is instructional supports of what's happening in core, what's happening in instruction and intervention groups. What great way to look at this is opportunities to respond. Are kids engaged with learning? Are they having opportunities to respond? Are they successful? And how's that feedback? Collecting that data tells us a lot of how the instruction is happening in the core level and also the instructional intervention support groups at tier 2. The other data sources that we might want to consider are diagnostic data, program assessment data, fidelity data. Are we implementing how we said we're going to implement? Are we implementing the program as it's designed and with fidelity? If we aren't, we have to shore that up and fix those issues so we can see all kids grow, hopefully. The next thing we might want to consider is using student and family perception data. If students aren't growing within tier 2 supports, why not? Let's ask them sometimes. It might be something basic like the environment doesn't work for them or they don't understand why they're there. So, oops, shut that off. So we're going to examine disproportionality of impact of progress on our tier 2 supports. So how are we going to do that? Lisa, next slide. So the decisions that we have to make when we meet as a group, that's the next step, is we make adjustments in our intensifications based on predetermined decision rules and options for intervention changes. And here's kind of the 4 big things that we have to do as a team doing this. 1, we got to analyze our data. Are all kids growing or not? Okay. The next thing we have to determine is, are we going to continue this intervention or are we going to exit? If all kids are growing, then we have to make that decision if we're going to continue this or end it, or if we're going to exit for some and not for others. The next thing we have to do is, if we notice that some kids aren't growing as well as others, or parts of that group aren't growing as well as others, we have to make intensifications and adjustments for the group and or for the individual. Okay, Lisa, let me go on. In order to guide those decisions, we use these crazy things called decision rules. And decision rules are there for guiding this decision-making process. They're typically developed at the district level, and they just give us some parameters of how we're going to make these decisions. I'm not going to read these for you. You're welcome to dive into Tiger Tualatin's EBA's handbook here, and they have all kinds of great examples of decision rules that teams can adopt in order to guide this process. Developing and diving into deep rooms takes a deep dive, and at our community of practice coming up, we will take a little bit more look at how we can look at and develop decision rules. Next, Lisa. We also want to make, when we are making intensifications of adjustments, we're going to continue then to look through these lenses of instruction, curriculum, environment, and the learner as we develop and make plans and change what we're doing within our instructional groups. We got to always assume that it's about our actions that are causing that impact, and we have to change what we do in order to see better outcomes. So how can we change this program through these different areas in order to improve our programs for our students to see how well they can grow? Okay, Lisa, next slide. Another tool that you're going to need, and Lisa already presented to this, is our standard reading protocols. So once we have determined that there needs to be an intensification or an adjustment, that might be curriculum. We might have to change from one program to another to target the students and what they might need. In order to do this, we lean on our standard reading protocol to make those decisions. We just don't make those decisions based on our own thoughts or our own hearts and desires. Please move on there, Lisa. Here's another example of a standard reading protocol. This is from a smaller school district from Klatskai. There is one school district or one school district, but likewise, they have a structure that supports this process with the wealth of options of curriculum in order to meet the needs of all of their students. Lisa? Thank you. Next, we wanted to look at disproportionality of that impact within our Tier 2 supports. So are we disproportionately impacting students' progress with Tier 2 supports, and how do we know? So the first thing we want to look at is disaggregated data. And what are we going to look at when we disaggregate it? We're going to look at students that have been entered or placed in the interventions, and then students that are exited. So if we're placing students at a disproportionate rate, and we're also not exiting them at a proportional rate, we have a huge problem on our hands. Furthermore, data sources we might look at to unpack this problem are our diagnostic data and our assessment data from our programs, and also our student and family perception data. What we're trying to look at, though, is that disproportionality of students who have exited or who have been placed and don't exit interventions. Lisa? So this slide just shows, once again, the placement, the disproportionality in placement that we have on our hands. So once again, our Hispanic Latino population makes up 38% of our student population. We are placing 47% of them within interventions. That's a huge discrepancy compared to the other student populations that we have in our school. But furthermore, we have to measure impact. Lisa? Thank you so much. In order to determine if we are having impact within that Tier 2 level of supports, though, we need to disaggregate further to see, are we exiting students at a proportional rate? And as you can see here from our data, that not only are we disproportionately placing them, we are disproportionately exiting them, leaving some students and large quantity of students in interventions. So there's a problem on our hands that we have to address. Lisa? So once again, like Lisa said, it's all about the core if we're in this situation. So if we're in a situation, if we find ourselves disproportionately impacting our students, what can we do about it? Number one, go back to your core. Adjust your core supports and ensure that that core is rich, it's culturally relevant. You're flooding into supports at that level. Review your core curriculum for cultural relevance and content. Review your Tier 2 curriculum for the same thing, cultural relevance and responsiveness. Examine your core program and intervention program for consistent language, responses, and routines. If that's, some of our struggling readers need the most consistency, and they get some of the least consistency in their programs. And last, can we add culturally relevant practices to Tier 2 supports? How can we intensify those programs to make them rich with culturally responsive practices? Lisa? Logistics. Here's some logistics in order to conduct an intervention review meeting. When do we do it? We conduct them about every 8 to 10 weeks following initial placement and or last review. The time you'll need is about 45 minutes to an hour. You can get it down to 40 to 45 minutes if you follow a really quality agenda and your teams are skilled at it. But when you're first building this practice, I would leave at least an hour to an hour and 15 in order for everybody to run this smoothly. Who should attend? Once again, grade level teams. If you can have your grade level teams, teachers, and also support staff, EAs, IAs, and other support people, that would be an amazing, robust system. You need high quality systems, also have literacy specialists, the administrators, other learning specialists, ELL specialists, speech paths, counselors, etc. So whoever you can provide to that table that's going to provide supports for teachers, students, families to improve outcomes. Here's a list of the data that you'll need. One of the main tools you're going to need is lean on your agenda. It's easy to go off on an agenda when you're conducting intervention review meetings. So this is just advice from myself. Please lean heavily on your agenda and try to stick to it. And also, you're going to need some guiding, some decision rules in order to guide this process as well. Lisa, next slide. Here's just the protocols that we step through that's in our intervention review process, and we've left that in the resources. So essentially, these are the main decisions that a team will have to go through. They're going to analyze the group and an individual. They're going to decide then, are they going to continue or exit? They're going to then decide if they need to intensify, adjust for the individual, and then also then for the group. And then they're going to record and document all of those decisions. Lisa? Once again, we have some examples and non-examples of past practice and best practice. So this may have looked, and you may have seen yourselves in this model in the past and some of these things. So in the past, we may have had individual teachers doing these decisions. Now we're going to have teams to do this decision making. Well, in the past, we maybe have limited to no data. Now we're going to have rich multi-data sources. And also, we are going to use a team in order to make adjustments and intensifications and not leave that up to just one person. And Lisa? Here's a list of resources for you to dive into in order to develop these systems in your school. We have the TTSD EVA's handbook. We have our just updated intervention review agenda and some worksheets that we just kind of got hot off the presses. And we also will be the center, some part of the center focus of our community of practice coming up later this month. And we also have some resources from NCII here. Lisa? So some suggested next steps for you and your team. Reflect on where you are with your intervention placement and review processes. Where is your team in this progression and building these systems? Do an audit of these following things. Do an audit of your data sources. Do an audit of your current teaming structures at your tier 2 level about placement and review processes. Do an audit of your tier 2 supports in general, your interventions, and they're also your materials and your instructional practices you've built into the tier 2 supports. And last, let's consider our staff's capacity in order to deliver, monitor, and review these tier 2 supports by providing the amount of time they're going to need to meet, and also to deliver interventions, and also consider the time they need to train. Thank you. I'll pass it over now to David and Sarah, and I just want to thank everybody for attending today. David?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Get my video going here. Thank you, Brad, and Sarah, and Lisa, and Nicole for all of that. Really a lot of information there. I hope the information has been helpful. There's a lot packed in there, but I'll just remind everybody that we, that the session will be recorded. We will share the PowerPoint, we'll share the recording of the session. And as with any kind of training, it's only as valuable as you make it by taking it back to gather with your teams and dig into the what you learned in the content at a deeper level and really focus on application. So we have a little bit of extra time here, which is great. So what I'd like to do is move to the next slide. And just first, before we get to questions, I first want to just go over some of the kind of wrap up information so we're all clear and on the same page. And then we should have some time and we can continue to take some questions. If you haven't been watching the chat, there's been a lot of good questions there already, and we've tried to provide information and resources, and we'll include those in what we share out later. But so anyway, let me wrap up with a couple things and then we'll get back to some more questions. So just a reminder that, well, and I've already just said, we will record the webinar and the PowerPoint and handouts, and we'll share all that afterwards. So you will have all those resources. And then also we're going to drop a link to the evaluation into the chat. And if you can take care of that right away today, that would be really helpful. We really do value and appreciate any feedback that you can give us on the content, the process, and delivery of the webinar. So thank you in advance for that. A link will also go out later as well. All righty, and next slide, please, Lisa. Reminder that we've got a couple more in this series, a couple more webinar / trainings in this series. The next one will be April 14th, and we'll focus on special education practices. And then we'll have a culminating event on May 10th, and the exact nature of that is double top secret. No, I'm just kidding, but we really have kind of reserved one last final gathering to address issues that have evolved over the course of this. This has been an interesting year and an interesting time, and things continue to change. We've tried to adapt to that, and we'll have one final event to kind of wrap up, and we'll let you know what that will look like later. And registration for all these things and everything else, as well as tons of resources, are on our website, which is right there. Okay, next slide, please. In addition to this series, I just want to remind people, we went over this at the beginning, so here's just another slide with that information about our annual conference sessions that are coming up, and really some excellent information that will be shared there. We've got some excellent presenters with breakout sessions that really dig deeper into a lot of specific applications within these areas. So that also you can register for on our website. All right, I think that's it for just some general wrap-up information. You know, again, I emphasize taking this back to your teams and reflecting, integrating, and applying to the work that you do to move this work forward. And with that, if you have more questions, please, why don't you put those in the chat, and we'll look at those and do our best to answer questions now. And if there are no questions, we can wrap up and address questions that might come up later from you folks individually. Going to pause just a minute to allow for some think and write time, and see if there's anything more we can answer.
There's a question in the chat, David, about all students taking part in a benchmark assessment, or often called screening assessment, 3 times a year. And that is common. That's common guidance. Fall, winter, and spring is usually what you hear for all students. That allows you to sort of make some decisions about access. Sorry, my camera is sort of turning off and on, or I would turn it on, but this is Sarah Arden. Access to core, and it really allows you to sort of make right on time decisions around the kind of instruction that you're delivering and how your system is generally working.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't see that one pop
There
up.
I am. Hi. I think I addressed your question, Mari, but if not, please let me know, and we can talk through that. So generally, that's what universal screening would address, kind of 3 times a year, typically thought of as fall, winter, spring, and for all students.
I will add on to that while we wait to see if anything else pops up. I mean, really important to include all students, and there can continue to be questions about that over time, and whether or not it should just be students that you have some question or concern about. We really feel strongly that it's important and valuable to assess all students, because you really want to use that data to not only identify students that are in need of additional support, but to take a comprehensive look at the effectiveness of your core instruction overall. And to have all students participate really allows you to do that, and really allows you to, in a more accurate way, disaggregate your data and make decisions about the needs of different groups too.
Yeah, it can also, and I think to piggyback on what David said, also allows us to try not to make assumptions about what students will always perform at what levels. It allows us to sort of level set and really try to get a true snapshot in time about how all students are performing, especially, and I think Mari, and I'm happy to chat with you about this, Mari, if you want to send me an email or you want to kind of continue this conversation, especially struggling readers or students that are really having a difficult time accessing both literacy instruction or things like that. This is especially critical for them, because it's important that we have a really sort of clear sense about what it is that they are needing support with, so that we're able to deliver that, especially in early grades, K1, K2, 3, and that we nip that sort of as early as we can and address it so that they get what they need.
Okay. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say there's another question about help with disaggregating data. And I didn't mean to step over you, David, if that's what you were going to address. We have resources to help with that.
Yeah, we do, and I think some today, and the content within here, I think, provides just an initial kind of overview, but some structures that can be used. And again, I think to go back in and dig in a little deeper. But we also have some other specific resources on the website, and we have some short video training vignettes that talk about disaggregating data for within different assessment systems that I believe are still there and still relevant. Not sure how to direct people to find those exactly off the top of my head, but on our website they are there, and we can get back to people about that. Coaches have something more specific to add?
Many of the systems, such as the DIBELS, the CTL version, Acadian, CCCBM, have the capacity to and have that data, the demographic data, put into the system. So then, and there's reports then that you can use that will give you the disaggregated data information. So probably would be, if you have a tech person in your district, they would probably know best about that piece of getting that information into your data system.
Thank you.
I also have, never mind, this is what I was looking for. I think also, just to piggyback on that with what Lisa just said, also just making sure that you are looking at other subgroups of your data. So, there's not really a step-by-step guidance, but making sure that you're not just saying this whole group scored as a tier, needs tier 2, and this whole group needs to look at tier 3, but doing a little bit more digging, whether it's in your data system or actually going back to look at protocols or however it is that you're doing your assessments, and actually taking a good look at, like, who are those students and what do we know about them, is a really simple, just sort of way to start. Same with like attendance data, looking at like who wasn't here, who didn't come, what Lisa and I think Nicole talked about when we talk about giving sort of the highest cognitive load to our students that have the most significant needs. So take a look at your students and sort of get a sense of like, who are we asking to move around the most? And when is that? And when are they missing? So there's sort of simple ways where it's not like this big formal system of disaggregation, that you can actually start to sort of look at these multiple data points to really sort of help you think about equity, where you say, gosh, are we taking our students that really are having sort of have significant academic or behavioral needs, and asking them to do quote unquote the most, go the most places, see the most teachers, learn the most different curriculums, et cetera, like that's just interesting and likely highly useful information.
We were talking to a school recently that did just that. They looked at a student who was, I think, receiving EL services and tier 2 support services, and they counted the amount of transitions the student did, and he was doing 25 transitions in a day. And then they compared that to a student who wasn't getting extra support, and it was about 10 transitions a day. And those were to like, and this was pre-COVID. So as they're transitioning to PE or to music, just those normal things. And if you keep seeing that trend with a certain group, ethnicity group of students or EL, or your students receiving special education services, that's something just to look at and to reflect on.
And this is sort of just to step back to the question, because I've had a couple of comments just directly to me. When someone asked about universal screening 3 times a year, I just want to make sure that my answer was clear, that all students should have universal screening, or what someone called benchmark data, but typically we consider it universal screening. It often happens at fall, winter, and spring. All students should participate in that. That's students with disabilities, students without disabilities, students who are language learners, students, all of your students should participate in that 3 times a year. That gives you really important information in which to make critical decisions in your building. So I want to make sure that that was clear. I think maybe my answer was unclear, and that was unintentional for my part, but I do want to make sure that I clarify sort of my point around the 3 times a year data point collection.